will be. All right, hold on a second. You have a technical question already? Do we have to like approve or something? You should be able to, you should just be able to join. I don't know if there's anybody who has to approve it. Were you able to go ahead and? Okay, good. Good. Okay. Yeah, I don't think we're restricting anybody from joining. All right. So, why did that go away? Yeah, but okay. All right. Okay, so the philosophy track. Oh, so first of all, if you're a speaker, you can't stand in front of the screen, apparently. So don't stand in front of the screen. All right, the philosophy track is a little different because we want you to be part of the conversation the whole time. So reason why we want you in Slack is it's going to be hard to ask questions and interrupt the speaker, although we do invite you to do that. But we want you to be able to ask questions in the Slack channel. What I need help with from who's gonna stay in the philosophy track the whole time, or as long as possible. So yeah, so what I need help is Steve, if you don't mind. Okay, every time we have a new talk, we need to start a new thread, and so create that new thread with the talk title, and people join that thread, and we have a conversation in that thread. Okay, in that thread, if there is something interesting that someone asks a question about, or an interesting point, pin it, okay? Make it evident that this is something interesting. Don't just emoji it, actually pin it or star it or do something that calls it out, okay? If there's questions that you want to ask and you don't want to forget it at the end, ask the question there, and the speaker, like Bryson, who just walked over to get coffee, whoever the speakers are, they will be obligated to go and answer the questions offline, or sometime after the talk, okay? But we still want people to have questions back and forth after the talk, during the talk, and so on and so forth. This is just a way that we can quickly get a lot of information out as fast as possible, okay? So that's why getting in Slack and being part of the conversation there is really important, and we expect the speakers to be able to respond back in Slack if you have questions there, okay? The whole point of this particular track is to build something together from like a thought leadership or some sort of document sort of standpoint, okay? And Gotti has wanted me to produce some set of proceedings every year. The best we've done so far is a set of working documents that we've produced from the last year's conference, okay? So we produced 3 framework documents, one around workforce professionalization. What does that mean? One around product testing, one around hazards and forecasting, and then one on near misses, okay? So this is the other thing I need someone to help with. Not right away, but when we you'll note in the agenda that we have a lot of open time, unscheduled time after the talks. That time is actually to build these frameworks and to have a deeper discussion around whatever frameworks that we choose to work on after the talks, okay? So each of the talks, I hope that there's a nugget there that says, wow, we really want to dig deep in that, okay? Whatever that is. And so we'll create a framework document and start building that document together. And I want you guys to see yourself as contributors to that document as well. We did some really awesome work last year for those who were here on each one of these. And you're welcome to go and hit them and see what they look like. But we want to continue to produce similar documents for the work that we do here, okay? Any questions before I keep chattering on? Okay. All right. So going back to like, what's the goal here? Again, we're trying to mature our practice. We're trying to share our methodologies. We're trying to do things that will help us essentially push our industry forward and create models and frameworks so that we can all understand, have a model that we can use to be able to share to our colleagues back at home, have reference implementations, things that we can actually put to practice, not just talk about it. That's the philosophy track. One of the things that we have the danger of doing is just making it ivory tower-ish. We actually want to put these into practice, and if we can't do that, then that's not going to be very helpful. And the most important thing is that we continue this conversation after the conference. So the working documents are really just a way to set an anchor for the content, but going forward, we would want people to continue to iterate on them. So we didn't have, last year we had a couple people iterate on some of the documents. Tom Millar from DHS did, and so did Adam Shostak. The other ones didn't get as much of attention, but the point is that it lives on past this conference, okay? All right, so with that, I'm gonna turn it over to Bryson. Oh, just as a quick aside, the agenda, as Gotti mentioned, is somewhat in flux. I had 3 speakers drop out for various reasons: broken phones, sick child, fires at work, all that kind of stuff. So where you see me listed there, it's only as a placeholder. As Gotti suggested, I can talk on and on and on and on. Some people like hearing me talk, others probably don't. So if I can find an alternative talk and/or we have a really interesting discussion that we want to give more time to, then I'm reserving those time frames for those things, okay? And that said, you know, if you actually like the talk that I'm proposing, then we can have that talk too, okay? All right. And like I said, if you are a speaker for this track, come see me, and I need to make sure that we work out all the details. So with that, over to Bryson, and he's going to talk about, well, I'll let him talk about the history of this talk. So, all right. This is going to be one of my favorites. No pressure.
I'm here because Sunil made me. These are some ideas I've been working on for about 3 years. And at the half-baked stage, I gave them at Shmoocon a year ago, and it fell over completely flat. I think I've had all of 2 people come up to me afterward and go, "Got that. That kind of made sense, and those are interesting ideas." And he was one of them. And then he said, "Why don't you come? I'm holding this conference. Why don't you give it again?" So bear with me. The full title of Rethinking How We Think About Cybersecurity, I think, has 2 important qualities. It's convoluted and it's pretentious, which sounds like it's perfect for us in information security. Because here's the challenge and why the industry continues to churn. We continue to expand this body of knowledge, which, no offense, the operations track is what they're continuing to do, is we continue to grow into this unknown, but we never solve the problems. And I think we don't solve the problems for 2 reasons. 1, we have a hard time describing them. And 2, we have a hard time finding a place where we can actually bound the problem. Because if we can't bound the problem, then how can you quantify it? How can you measure it? How can you have anything more than an opinion? And opinions are great, but opinions aren't repeatable. And opinions only work until they're proven wrong. But how do you prove it right? And how do you predict that? So we don't have a clicker, do we? So goals. 1, the goal of the talk is, can we evolve threat intelligence? Can we move beyond standard, static, ephemeral IOCs? And then what if we could find some way to begin to quantify defense? Now, that's a big ask, but I think there are elements where we can bound and we can start to quantify, and at least that's the starting point. So let's start with the ecosystem behaviors. There is always going to be constraints in any environment. 1, whatever solution it is has to be easy to deploy, has to be simple to operate, it has to be stable. Turns out defensive solutions that wreak havoc in an environment aren't going to help anybody. And then efficacy. How does it work? Does it actually work? And are we able to prove that? since I just saw Julian walk in the room, his talk later this afternoon is also going to dovetail into some of these pieces. Say hi, Julian. All right, so host architecture. This is the fundamental building blocks of a computer. Why is that important? Because all defensive solutions on a host all decide to reside at the kernel level. Why do we decide to reside at the kernel? That got really loud. Oh, am I getting feedback under? Aha. Okay, so can't stand there, can't stand there. Is this really what you meant? Can't put baby in a corner. I really want to stand there. It's, well, I don't. So we can have a talk more like this, just be sort of like two guys between a fern. So at the kernel level is where we put host defensive solutions, and the reason we do that is that logic follows those original system constraints. Yeah, I'm blocking your slides now. I can't feel comfortable here. There's somewhere I got to be. Should I just go to the back? Yep. But then I have to run over there to push the button. See? System constraints being demonstrated in real time.
Just keep talking and say next.
Okay. Oh, thank you, sir.
You're welcome. Which button do you want me to push?
The right arrow button. So that's a good question. For those of you who don't know, I co-founded the ICS Village, which is a nonprofit that does education awareness of industrial control systems. And we have this huge industrial range that we bring to different conferences. Oh, dude, awesome. He's got, like, you're being replaced.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Automation.
Yeah.
I
do
except
threat modeling for robotic systems, so maybe we can.
I've got the new Mac, though. This actually may not. I do have the dongle. It's got an extra one on here. Can it do two things at once? Let's find out. Oh, wow. There you go. High five. What? Now I got to go over there? Okay. And so we have this huge range, and it's all these different parts. It's like it's power supply, and it does water management. It does all these things, illustrating elements of the critical infrastructure. And so one of the big things we always do is, like, it's, you know, you can come up and touch it. We want people to interact and learn about critical infrastructure. And in one of these conferences, this lady goes, oh, really? And immediately hits the big red button, which shuts everything down because it's the safety button. So good question on which button to press. All right, so host defensive solutions at the kernel level. The reason that we do that, of course, is that's the balance of system constraints. I am here. I am theoretically able to see everything. But going back to those earlier constraints, I have to be predictable. I have to be built in so that system, and I'm managing those pieces. I'm not depending on the operating system to provide me resources. I need to be sure that I'm not going to cause conflicts. So I need to be stable in the environment, which, of course, leads us to the disadvantage that host defensive solutions, by being predictable and it being in the same place every time, means they're very easy from an offensive perspective to reverse engineer and determine where they are, which is why we typically see on the defensive side, we find offense for two reasons. One, the attacker makes a mistake, or two, something changes in the environment, which changes that, and then their stability goes awry. So assumptions. Like death and taxes, exploitation is a given in life. Given enough money, given enough time, given enough resource, exploitation will happen. That's just technical, though. If you start to abstract that, it's a question of access. I don't always have to defeat everything through a technical means. Exploitation is great because it allows me to be in an internet cafe somewhere around the world and be able to do something. But there are lots of other methods and access that work that don't require exploitation. But since we're at a pseudo-researcher conference, we have to have something about O-Day, and there you go. Second, the attacker space is discrete. Going back to, if we can bound it, if we can find some way to have that discussion and bound it, then we can start to have a foundation to grow from. So the hypothesis, the attacker space can be defined, but we need a periodic table. We need some way. I always mix it up. The molecules or the atoms, the molecules. Molecules down to atoms? Okay. My mom's a science teacher, too. She'd be so ashamed. Okay, so what we want to do is find a way to describe the metaphor of molecules that can be derived, like chemistry, into atoms when we describe defense, when we describe what's happening. The closest thing that we have so far is the MITRE ATT&CK framework, but the MITRE ATT&CK framework is a mixture of atoms and molecules, which confuses it, and I think we can simplify it even further. So the potential attack space really only consists of two things: communications and pathways, and behaviors. Across those two axes, we can start to define those molecules. Communications are the pathways and the protocols of which, how we talk. Attackers, unless they're doing something extraordinary, like defeating the laws of physics or going out of band, have to use the pathways organic to an enterprise, which means they have to use the communication protocols that are already there. Anything that is too anomalous is going to stick out, so they blend in. Well, how many communication protocols are there? Turns out, well, you gave the eyebrows, but I mean, how many are there really? Give me a number real quick. I'm fucking with you. I feel like I should return the favor to the audience with what I've been having to deal with, and you just made eye contact at the wrong time. There are a number of ways to talk, and there are derivatives of those ways, but fundamentally, I mean, the whole reason we have communication protocols that are agreed is so that computers can talk to other computers, because that's what we want. That's why Al Gore created the internet. Right? It doesn't work if I try to send an email to somebody and they're like, well, I have a different email protocol, and at that point you're just dealing with MacMail. To behaviors, thank you, at least someone gets the jokes. It's the philosophy track, the jokes, you gotta wait like a second. I'll slow down, I'll delay. See, thank you. All right, to behaviors, what kinds of things are being exhibited? Tying this back to MITRE ATT&CK, communications are the C2, lateral, and exfil categories, and the behaviors are elements of persistence, privileges, credentials, collection, and discovery. So our surface area, this is pulled from MITRE KPEC. This is our enterprise surface area. Tying that to the state of the industry, we have our view and then the adversarial view. And that's actually supposed to be kind of Venn diagramish in the middle where it's a different color, because that's cool, but you can't see it. What the adversary can see that we can't is the information arbitrage we're trying to understand. Where they plan, and then what we can see is access and activity, tying it back to the earlier pieces. And then our view, of course, is the business impact of those access and activities. So what is the risk? Risk is the probability of impact, vulnerability, and threat intersecting. Threat without access, without going through that surface area, without finding vulnerability in that surface area, doesn't mean anything. Actually, do you want to throw in some words here? Yeah.
So part of the idea of bounding our space is that when we think about characterizing the threat or the attack, you can usually break it down to a vector and an exploit. Okay, vectors are bounded, exploits are not. Vectors are bounded, exploits are not. And one of the things that we traditionally try to do is put out controls on the vector space because it is the most stable. New vectors do not emerge regularly, but new exploits emerge all the time. So what we want to be able to do in terms of understanding what this discrete space is, again, we're trying to bound the problem. How do we bound the problem? Let's look at those things that remain, for the most part, static. And so when we look at the threats that come in, the attacks that come in, again, we can break up the vectors into the exploits. The exploits are always going to be changing because attackers evade our set of controls or whatever signatures, patterns, whatever we put in to look for that exploit. But the vector itself is, again, remain for the most part the same. The likelihood that the exploit becomes easier and easier to execute increases over time. The feasibility of the exploit increases over time. The speed at which our controls degrade is based on that, how quickly those exploits evolve as well. So is that what you meant? Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So going back to our challenge earlier, is if exploitation is a given, it's a question of what's our ability to do that compared to our surface area, which ties to our controls. And so we have volatility on one side, but there is a part that we can control. And then, of course, understanding that impact influences our understanding of our ability to prioritize that and our interest in it. And so what we end up with is what we see, and we've all seen this anecdotally, is that defensive products have a half-life. I mean, tying to that, where it's that combination of how do vectors and exploits in their different ways erode our controls, we see some form of half-life. Part of that is that, I'm a startup. Who in here is in a startup? Yes. Power to the startup. Startups are the cutting edge of cybersecurity. What we talked about earlier being on the edge of knowledge, that's where cybersecurity tends to work until it doesn't, going to this half-life problem. And the reason for that is once you achieve a certain mass, then you get on the radar of an adversary. And that adversary then pulls in your tool, reverse engineers it, and figures out how to defeat it, how to evade it, how to disable it, how to do anything. Attackers' quality control is using your defensive tools to test before they release into the wild. So can we anticipate failure? Is there a way, looking at people, process, and technology, where we can start to predict decay rates or that half-life of controls? And this is a part of the discussion element then, is what are those factors, right? Is it a question of motive? We see this a lot in, for example, where certain applications are shown to have vulnerabilities, and then it seems like there's a rush of vulnerability disclosures that go with that as the entire researcher community writ large. Obviously, it's a little bit more opaque when we're talking about professional hacking. Target complexity. Now, it's funny, target complexity can have two different pieces here. Certainly, the more complexity we have, the more surface area we have, but at the same time, the more heterogeneity, the more complexity in a target, the harder it is for an attacker to start to break through the multiple controls that you're going to have employed. And then community interest. When the community starts to, like I described, focus on something, does that mean that there's going to be more exploits, there's going to be more opportunities? Potentially there's a breakthrough in an additional vector that had not been considered before is discovered? That's it. Oh, thank you. Unlike right now?
So let me explain that slide on the right.
I'll give you all the sense.
All right. So the question here is, what is that half-life? How quickly do our controls degrade? If we can define that discrete space that the attacker lives in, how often does that discrete space change so that we need to then put in new controls, new capabilities, and so on and so forth? And so the idea of this particular chart is, first of all, if you're not familiar with the cyber defense matrix, go see one of my old slides. But the idea is, in each of these different boxes, if you will, we have a lot of different controls, and those controls degrade over time or collapse based on the introduction of new vectors, okay? So they degrade over time as exploits become more and more feasible. They collapse as new vectors emerge. Let me give you an example. if I'm a prison warden, and I have a threat model for my prison, okay? One of my threat models is going to say aerial attack vectors it's a known vector to be able to infiltrate my jail, okay? Back in the 70s, the exploit for that would have been a helicopter. Today, it would be a drone. And the evasion techniques of that exploit, of an aerial attack vector, look something like this over time, okay? So I need to be able to anticipate, actually I don't know which way it goes, but anyway, it's a linear line, if you will, okay? And the idea is that I should be able to anticipate over time that my aerial attack vector will become more and more exploitable, okay? And so my controls associated with that will degrade generally gracefully. However, in the discrete space that Bryson was talking about, if some new discrete space appears, then all my controls collapse. So if some new researcher comes up with teleportation, then all my existing controls collapse immediately, okay? We want to try to avoid that, because that's pretty bad. So let's make sure we understand what our discrete space is, what the discrete attacker space is, so that we can then anticipate all those vectors. And then within a given vector, what is the decay curve for the exploits within that vector? Does that make sense? Okay, that's the problem that we're trying to solve here. And it says illustrative, but we're actually trying to collect anecdotal data and empirical data on how much churn there is in each of these boxes, so that we know, for example, how often do we need to send people to training, because the techniques have changed every year, okay, in which case I need to send somebody to training every year. Insider threat analysts, the drivers of human behavior don't change every year. They don't change at all, right? So do I need to send somebody for insider threat training every year? Probably not. But do I need to send somebody for training on how to hunt on an endpoint? Probably, okay? And so that's the idea. And if we can figure out what that discrete space is, be able to start quantifying things, then we have a way to essentially plan for obsolescence over time.
This is why you're the smart one. Although Will is the smartest guy in the room. Thoughts? Questions?
To what extent are you talking about predicting the decay?
Thanks. To what extent are you predicting the decay of the control itself versus the decay of the implementation of that control within an environment?
All right, so did everybody hear that? Okay, good. Yeah, this is funny. This actually ties to some really long conversations you and I were having last night about theory and then application. So I would say it's the control in use is what we care about versus the theory of the control. Because, I mean, at the end of the day, that application is in fact what's providing the defense. I mean, I'm sure somebody who's a manager would say otherwise, but that's why they get paid to do nothing.
Actually, let me answer your question, because ultimately the control degrades because of the novelty of people. Okay, the novelty of we're fighting people, not machines. At least not right now. Or at least right now we're not. Right. Yes, we'll eventually get there. But we're fighting people, and the controls are static controls that people find ways around. So the control isn't degrading as much as the people are finding ways to evade that control.
So hi. So I defend applications at a bank. I'm Bill. Okay, so my disagreement with you is that in the case of devices, in the case of my servers in the world before we decided to throw everything on the cloud, on the identification side, multi-factor authentication, all these other things, all those factors get thrown out. I no longer can rely on the IP. Someone says to me, oh, no, everything will have a certificate. But then you find out that all the way underneath the hood, that chain of trust from the certificate out has been broken, and someone's issuing the same certificate to everybody. So they're saying whoever they want to be within the world. So that's just an example of where your change of technology can no-op a whole line of stuff that you've been using, maybe to identify, maybe to detect, whatever. So that's my point.
Yeah, so great. So I'll just give you some real examples of where things have collapsed. So yeah, so IoT causes a collapse in our ability to know what devices we have in our environment. All of a sudden, all these things appear. Where the heck do they come from? What controls do we have to be able to manage that, to discover that? So that's a collapse of a control, right? Side channel attacks or things like Spectrum Meltdown, right? That was a whole new vector that emerged, okay? Or some people would say it was theorized for a while, but the exploitability of it wasn't proven until someone proved it, and now, voila, you have a new vector that people need to care about. And so it causes a collapse of controls. We want to, again, avoid those. And that's part of the idea of can we define the discrete space so that we know we need to be on the lookout for those things.
But it goes further than just because a vector is what allows me to get in, and it's also what allows me to get out, right? So even if I've defeated your credentials and gained access, for me to still, again, I still have to do activity on that endpoint, so I'm still exhibiting behaviors, and then there's still communications. So this goes to, again, being able to describe the problem. Even if there is a collapse in a control, there still should be a way to see that, and that's one of the challenges we have now is, are we seeing those things? And then, of course, being able to move beyond that is then being able to predict it.
I have a question for you. This is from a lapsed physics guy. Have you tried verifying this model? I like this model, but do you have any numbers that confirm it?
So that's one of the asks. No, this is a challenge, and like Sunil was talking about, is we have some anecdotal observations. We have some very limited empirical evidence. We're trying to take that even further. And one of the challenges that I've had is I've gone and talked to a lot of companies that provide threat intelligence. And if you look at the kind of data they're collecting, they're not at this level. And so from our view, it's effectively worthless in terms of advancing the intellectual framework versus being able to statically, go, okay, now employ this static control. So they're very reactive in like providing, limited static barriers versus being able to kind of take the next step, because what you would really want with threat intelligence is, again, what's my ability to be able to predict and quantify that risk versus my ability to just go, oh, okay, that too. So yes, please, data, help.
So as a way to, again, the point of the point of these talks is to find a way that we can discuss frameworks and taking some of these ideas and concepts and building upon them. So at some level, I would like to, maybe in the Slack channel or someplace, I don't know if there's a way to vote, I guess. But yeah, so this would be, for example, we would say, hey, let's have a deeper dive on this and flesh out how do we actually measure the decay rates? How do we predict that? Where's the evidence? Where can we find evidence to help us understand how fast these evasion techniques are emerging, how frequently new vectors emerge? Okay, does that make sense, Steve?
One thing to look at is
You're not too loud.
is go back and look at past models. So there was some research done a number of years ago about looking at sort of the bell cows to exploitation, looking at old attacks and try to then predict for future. So I would suggest going backwards, looking at the vectors that we're all very familiar with now, that we all know and love, and instead of saying, well, that's old stuff, not looking at those time frames from research paper to first proof of concept, and look at that as a way to look at the decay of a control, is a way to get some of that data for what we can then predict to the future. That's a good idea.
wouldn't you expect that the decay of a feature would be tied to the potential for exploit? Let's say we started to use RSA tokens to secure funds transfers. Okay, there's money there, so now we're going to find out all those exploits to this kind of thing will be there because people were motivated to demonstrate them and decay them, right? Maybe other things are decaying at the same rate, but it's the ones you can make money at that you'll actually see real decay at.
Okay, so I think what you're maybe suggesting is it's not linear. So there's a long tail, or there's some. It's not a straight line.
Well, I'm suggesting that there's human motivation that causes things to happen.
Right, but initially the level of difficulty for one may cause it to be. Your control may be valid for a while because it's so hard. Once a group figures out, oh hey, I can now exploit this and make money off of it, it will accelerate the decay faster.
Yeah, and we also have to deal with the unfortunate thing that many controls, in fact, were broken, and it was not disclosed to us. They were built to be broken. Just anecdotally, when RSA got hacked all those years ago, and they stole the seeds, someone senior said, I don't want that to happen to me. And I said, excuse me, the controls which we are using were broken by the people who created them so that they could exploit them, the government. And now, unfortunately, time has passed, and the answer is it's not just the one person in the world who can do it. So there's that other piece, too. I think you got to ask, what is this control protecting? And if it's protecting something worth a lot of money, it's going to get banged.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so that's where we were talking about different rates of decay with motive and interest.
Global issue. Isn't that kind of like a global issue? Because it doesn't matter whether it means. I mean, this is really hard to predict. What I'm saying is, you don't necessarily have to be the first target. I mean, if this thing is being used to protect somebody else with a big secret or money worth secret, then you just might be, collateral damage here.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I agree with your point that exploits will always happen. So one of the important things I think might be useful is to identify the effectiveness of defenses in depth when we know each one of them in the chain is only partially effective. I mean, we've all had this scenario where we managed to put in a defense in depth even though our business said, what do we need that for? We got one thing and we're done, right? But somehow you managed to keep two things in. And then one day, one thing broke, and they said, oh my God, what do we do? And you say, well, we have that other thing behind it, so we're okay.
Okay, so thank you, Bryson. So for those who's this is the first time, hopefully you get a sense of how the conversation goes. Very interactive.